This is Reese Brady, dictating field report number 22, The Pilgrim File. Knox visited me in the emergency room. We took the opportunity to examine the contents of the box as a whole. We are re-evaluating these documents in the context of the full timeline we have developed for Dick Nash's movements during the period of concern. It has become clear that a large majority of these documents are not just irrelevant to the location of the package, but fall completely outside the scope of the investigation. Here, for example, is a personal statement about an anomalous observation made in the year 1979, when Nash was still going by his birth name of Stan Edmondson, bumping along the bottom of the professional world as a profoundly unimportant no one.
My name is Michael Kelly. It was a cold day in early April when this happened. Really cold. It had been an absolutely brutal winter. That had been followed by a few weeks of early spring warmth. Then winter came back to take one final bite out of the world. You could see your breath again when you went outside. Car windows had to be cleared of frost in the mornings. It was one more thing catching me totally unprepared that month. I had only just returned to the States from a 5-month stint at my papers overseas desk in the Middle East. I'd spent most of my time there covering the Iranian Revolution. When I got home, the first thing my wife said to me was she wanted a divorce. The following morning, I got a call while I was still working the Mr. Coffee. It was my office at the paper. They were giving me notice that I was no longer employed with them due to what they called downsizing, effective immediately. On top of all that, my Chevy was almost completely out of gas, right in the middle of a national fuel shortage. The radio was reporting long lines and angry, bewildered people stuck in their cars for hours, hoping to fill up. The papers were reporting about President Carter's wonderful, warm vacation in his hometown in Georgia. The evening news on the television was showing clips of station attendants exasperated by having to deal with customers furious that they suddenly couldn't get what they wanted anymore. I had spent the afternoon driving up and down the turnpike looking for a place that still had gasoline to sell. Almost nobody had their pumps running. Everywhere I went, there were makeshift signs saying "No gas," painted on sheets of cardboard and taped to the sides of the pumps. When I did finally find an old Gulf station that was still selling gas, the line stretched from its parking lot out to Hamilton, almost a whole mile to the north. I drove around some more, hoping someone else would still be open. But by then the sun was starting to set, and I was practically running on fumes. So I went back and found the Gulf station, and then drove all the way until I found the last car in line. I did a U-turn in my Chevy and joined the queue. By dinner time, I was still stuck in that line. Everybody was moving at a slow crawl. Everyone seemed to be taking turns honking their horns at each other. At one point, a police car swept past me with its lights on, headed south, in the wrong direction in the oncoming lane, towards the Gulf station. I figure there must have been some friction up ahead between two or more denizens of the same line I was stuck in. It started getting colder and colder inside my old Chevy as the evening grew darker. The line of brake lights and clouds of exhaust stretched out in front of me. I could tell by looking in my rearview mirror that the line behind me was only continuing to grow. I could not see the other cars, but I could see their headlights and the plumes of exhaust from idling engines floating above them, filmy and ethereal, lit up blue, yellow, and red. There I was, trapped in my car, listening to a radio report about a car bombing in Westminster. Everyone in that line that night was being forced to deal with the fact that the world had suddenly become very precarious. I kept eyeing my gas gauge nervously, wondering how much more idling my Chevy could take before I'd find myself stranded on the freezing dark side of the road with a dead car. I had seen that happen to other people several times before. I had seen the way everybody else just drove past them like they were invisible. I had seen the way I myself had done the exact same thing. Now, I was worried that it was about to happen to me. When the cold snap hit, I couldn't find any of my old winter clothes. I had no hat on that night while I sat shivering in my car. I had no coat either. To make do, I had pulled on an extra sweater and was using an old pair of tube socks for gloves. An enormous white Cadillac, as long as a football field, was sitting in the line right behind me. Its horn kept blaring every time the vehicles in front of me inched forward a bit, and I didn't get my car into gear fast enough. I could not see the driver of the white Cadillac in my rearview mirror. It was too dark outside, and there was too much glare from its headlights. I reached up and turned my rearview mirror to keep them from reflecting directly into my tired eyes. The radio was playing a recording of President Carter giving a speech. He was talking on and on about the energy crisis I found myself sitting right there in the middle of. He wanted America to turn towards more green energy. Then some commentator chimed in over the radio, talking about how solar panels had just been installed on the roof of the White House, and how a wood-burning stove had been added to its living quarters. That part of the turnpike was in a wooded area with few buildings. I noticed that we were crawling past a drive-in movie theater over on my left. The theater was closed and empty because it was the middle of the week and nothing was playing. But the way the oversized screen loomed up in the night sky against a backdrop of dark trees was at least giving me something to look at. The cars in front of me inched forward some more, and the driver of the white Cadillac leaned on it once again to get me to move. I took my time. I have to admit that I kinda hoped he'd try to swerve around and get in front of me, so I could hit the gas real quick all of a sudden and force him out of the line entirely. That would show him. But, although I like to think it is not possible for me to be that petty, the only real reason I refrained from doing so was that I was too afraid someone else would appear out of nowhere and swoop into the space instead. I continued to stay on the rear bumper of the guy in front as diligently as possible. I was sitting there, hunched over in the glare. The driver of the white Cadillac had decided to switch on his high beams. That is when it happened. The brake lights on the cars in front of me suddenly all went out. My own car shuddered to a stop, and the lights on my dash went dead. So did all the lights on all the cars behind me. It was as if we all ran out of gas and lost our batteries at the exact same instant. In the light of the moon, I watched the last tailings of car exhaust plumes drift up above the cars that had birthed them and then dissipate into nothing. There was a very distinct movement in the trees over to my right. Something absolutely gigantic was forcing its way through them. Despite the darkness, I could tell that whatever it was shook the big trees like toys in a diorama and was knocking over the smaller ones. I could not make out its shape, but I had the distinct impression of a wall of smoke coming towards me. It was smoke, but it was not borne along like it was caught up in a breeze or billowing out from the force of its own mass. It looked like it moved under its own power, deciding on which shapes to take as it twisted between and formed itself around the tree trunks and made its way in my direction. This wall of intelligent smoke finally emerged from the edge of the woods. There was an enormous thud that sent up twin clouds of dust about 8 paces from where my car sat. I could feel the air around my car displace with the force of violent, voluminous movement. I threw up my hands and screamed as something swooped out of the treetops and went right over my car. I wrapped my head in my arms and ducked as close to my seat as I could get. There was a heavy, cracking boom to my left, followed a moment later by another heavy thud that I could feel through the frame of my Chevy. I looked up out of my driver's side window, and I saw the Achilles tendon of the back of a gigantic ankle. Then the heel of a bare left foot as big as my car lifted up off the gravel driveway leading into the theater's parking lot. The thing that had stepped over my car and was now walking towards the movie screen was completely naked and stood about 80 feet tall. But other than that, it had the form of a man. He had a bulbous, hairless head that reflected the cold moonlight. That head was probably about the size of a hot air balloon. I know what I saw that night was real. I know because right as it was walking away from me, a bat flitted out of the woods. I could barely make it out in the dark, but I saw that bat fly right up to the thing's leg. Then, mid-flight, the bat made a sudden turn at almost 180 degrees to avoid flying into the thing's calf muscle. There was no reaction to any of this from any of the other vehicles. Other than the footfall of the giant creature, the night had gone silent. There were no idling engines. There were no honking horns. No radio could be heard playing from anyone's dashboard. I grabbed my rearview mirror and twisted it so that I could see the white Cadillac again. With no headlights to flood my vision, I could clearly make out the interior of the Cadillac. There was no one inside it. I put my hands back on my steering wheel and gripped it really hard. Then I turned the key in the ignition to the off position, and then I left it that way. I could see my breath inside the car now. Any heat the interior of my Chevy had been hanging on to was completely gone. I turned my head to see what the giant thing that had come out of the woods was doing. I saw it step behind the drive-in movie screen and crouch down low behind it, like it was trying to hide its presence from all the cars on the road. I continued sitting there for another minute. I got my nose right up to the ice-cold glass of the driver window and stared at the underside of the enormous movie screen. In the absence of lights from the highway, I could just barely see the thing's naked feet. The creature was sitting on its haunches, holding very still. Then I detected more movement out of the corner of my eye. Up ahead, to the right of the road, there was what I thought at first was a slow-moving aircraft of some type, moving silently and blotting out part of the night sky as it did so. Fear was starting to impinge upon my thoughts. For some reason, I hung on to the hope that what was moving through the sky was a police or government helicopter that had been following the otherworldly giant that had just stepped out of the woods and was now hiding at the drive-in. There was no change in air temperature as I slowly opened my door. I stepped out into the cold. When I did so and looked upon the endless row of now empty cars and trucks, it was as if they were relics of a past world. It was like I had stepped into a place that had long ago ceased to support human habitation. The only light now was from the moon and the stars. The only sound was my breathing and the terrified shrieks of birds in the woods. What was moving across the sky, heading from west to east, and now stepping across the road up ahead of me, was another unearthly giant. It was of the same proportions as the one that crouched behind the movie screen, but this one had a knot of hair tied at the top of its head and wore some kind of tunic. Beyond that giant, there were more. Some with clothing and other raiments, others as naked as the one that had stepped over my car. I turned to look back up the road to the north and saw the same thing, an army of alien giants moving across a cold, desolate, extinguished world. I became aware that there was a pitiless, perpetual moan coming out of each titanic mouth. No words were forming, not that I could recognize. It was just a constant, droning moan. I started praying. I prayed for all the lights to come back on, for all the people to reappear behind their steering wheels. I wanted them all to go back to savagely hitting their horns, to fretting, to fighting. I actually wanted to be smelling car exhaust again. All the giants seemed to be heading roughly east in unison. There were no city lights illuminating any of the horizons from where I stood on the hood of a delivery truck, peering into the dark, trying to make out where they were headed. Then I saw it. On the eastern horizon, like a supertanker turned over on its side and rotting on a shoreline that it was slowly polluting and rendering lifeless with its own blood, was an altar. That's the only word I can come up with to describe what I saw. It was an altar the size of a small city, its top appearing just above the eastern horizon. It was lit by what I can only describe as a steady, smokeless, black flame. The altar was a chaos of hard clay, a lump of death. There was a sound like a large door creaking open on old hinges. I saw the naked giant shift its weight on those huge feet. Its head rose like a second moon over the top of the movie screen. With one single step, it lurched into the woods behind the drive-in. A cloud of birds lifted off from nearby treetops as it did so. In just a few moments, it was gone from my sight. This made me scuttle down off of the truck's hood. For a second, I considered hiding under the truck, despite how cold I knew it would be that close to the tarmac on a night like that. But then I turned and began to walk up the line of cars, hoping desperately to find at least one more living soul. Then the moment was gone. I was being knuckled hard in the shoulder, headlights suddenly blinded my eyes. There was a small man in a wool cap rapping me on the shoulder with a gloved hand. His face contorted in an expression of rage. He was yelling something about how I was going to be in a lot of trouble if I did not get back in my car right away and get moving. I saw that the door of the white Cadillac was open, and this must be its driver. A truck had swooped past me and was tucking itself into the space that had been created in front of my car. It got most of the way in, with its rear partially jutting out into the other lane. Mr. White Cadillac trudged forward until his head with its ridiculous peaked hat was hovering just outside the truck's passenger window. He was yelling absolute profanities at the truck driver. He was yelling that the truck driver was going to be in a lot of trouble if he did not leave the line right away. The only response Mr. Cadillac received was the truck driver leaning relentlessly on his own horn, drowning out all speech. Mr. White Cadillac came back over to me and glared at me, now back in my car and trying to get the engine to start. It took me a second to realize he was yelling, "Lead, follow, or get out of the way," at me. He had a small, narrow mustache, a small, narrow mouth, and small, gray teeth. He kept jabbing the air with a gloved thumb, thrust in some random direction, telling me to get out of the line altogether if I knew it was good for me. His breath billowed out into the cold in great gusts. The traffic moved again, and the truck squared up in line. Nobody else, not the guy in the truck, not Mr. White Cadillac, made any indication that they had seen what I had. I was beginning to think I was going completely bonkers. Traffic crept ever forward. I crept along with it, turning my head every time the line stopped to look over to see if I could still spot giants on the eastern horizon. But they were gone. I had pulled off one of the tube socks so I could scan through every channel on both the AM and FM dial. There was nothing, no mention of a strange naked giant wandering the countryside. Just a report of some dangerous lunatic escaping a criminal asylum and the collapse of the Pol Pot regime. The line of cars crept past an empty bus station. Hanging on the outside wall of the bus station was a payphone. I desperately wanted to pull over and call the police and tell them what I had just seen. But I had been in that line way too long to risk losing my spot. So I stayed put and took no action besides keeping my eyes on the truck in front of me. 47 agonizing minutes later, I finally pulled up over the concrete of the filling station's lot. There was a man standing by the curb in the freezing air, stuffed inside an oversized parka and a trapper hat, barking orders at the drivers in the line with a bullhorn. "One customer at a time, only one customer at a time at the pump. Stay in the road." He was completely hoarse by the time I got to him. He must have been shouting through that bullhorn all evening. I could see the truck had finished getting gas and pulled away. The man with the bullhorn waved me past, and then stepped right in front of Mr. White Cadillac, bellowing across the vast expanse of front hood for the car to go no further. A second man came out of the gas station and told me it was cash only that night. I handed over a $5 bill and told him to please put as much in as that would cover. The attendant took the $5 from me and went around to the back of my car, got my tank open, and started filling it. Not 8 seconds later, the pump stopped working. The attendant walked back to me and told me they had run completely out of gas. All I owed him was 70 cents, and he would be right out with my change.
These entities, the naked giants, are something that I know the AARU is already very familiar with. These are a whole class of encounters that fall outside the scope of my investigation. Knox suspects a possible connection between the event described here and some of Nash's later activities, but I think that's a testament to her lack of familiarity with the firm's operations. More importantly, I found among these documents a very real indication that the assumptions we have been operating under so far have a striking inconsistency. Military documentation indicates that the package disappeared from the primary bunker at Fudd's location G77-5565. Decommissioning records indicate that Sergeant Stanley Edmondson, later writing under the name Dick Nash, secured Site G77-5565 in 1956, near the end of his brief military career. When the site was reopened in 2023, it was discovered that several items whose presence had been noted in the manifest at the time of the decommissioning could no longer be found in the primary bunker. An internal investigation concluded that they had most likely been stolen. The firm was then tasked with identifying the personnel who would have had access to these items and recovering them if possible. I have been a primary contributor to this effort for over a year. However, close inspection of a physical copy of the original manifest indicates that the package, a .50 caliber ammo box containing an item of interest, close inspection of the manifest reveals that the typewritten text actually reads G77-5655. This is not a typo. This is a different site altogether, not even located in the same U.S. state. Stanley Edmondson never even visited 5655. I'm going to need to rent a boat.